Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're venturing into ancient Egypt, specifically Oxyrhynchus.
That's right, and we're focusing on a really remarkable find there.
Absolutely. It's a Crux Gemmata, basically, a jeweled cross found in the Basilica of Saint Philoxenus.
Hmm.
And think of this as your direct line, We want you to get the key takeaways, the history, the symbolism, the art, without getting bogged down in excessive detail.
Exactly. Our mission here is to unpack what this specific cross tells us about early Christianity in Egypt. You'll come away with the core understanding, nice and clear.
Okay, so Oxyrhynchus, let's set the scene. You're looking at a place about 190 kilometers south of Cairo.
Near modern El Bonassa.
Right, and this wasn't just some backwater town. It was strategically important way back from the Secolite period through Greek and Roman times.
It had different names, Pyramid originally, then Oxyrhynchus after Alexander the Great showed up, named after a local fish, actually.
Huh, interesting detail. And it stayed important right up until the Islamic period, though its prominence faded after that. But for us, the real treasure is what came out of the ground.
The papyri, famously.
Yeah.
An incredible archive.
Exactly. And this very place became a major center for Coptic Christianity.
And right in the heart of this historical layer cake, you've got the Basilica of Saint Philoxenus.
The largest one found there so far.
Yeah, and what's really telling is where it was built, right on top of the old Serapeum.
A temple to Serapis. That's quite a statement, isn't it? Building a basilica right over a pagan temple site.
It really is. It perfectly shows that religious shift, that transformation taking place.
So this basilica, it was in use from about the 5th century up to the late 8th century AD. Pretty grand structure too, 5 naves, oriented east, and it had a crypt.
And that crypt is key. It wasn't just storage. Inside one of the inner chambers, that's where they found our Crux Gemmata.
And those chambers were probably, what, for burials?
Seems most likely, yeah. Christian burials.
Yeah. Which makes finding this specific cross there even more intriguing.
It does, because the Crux Gemmata, it's more than just a religious symbol. It's packed with meaning. It brings together Christ's passion, the suffering, the sacrifice, but also ideas of royalty, of triumph.
Then the materials themselves often had those imperial links, right? Power,
Character.
status.
Gold gems. They spoke a language of power.
Okay, let's zoom out for a second. The cross symbol itself, it wasn't originally Christian, was it?
Not at all. The basic shape, 2 intersecting lines, pops up in loads of pre-Christian cultures. Mesopotamia, Egypt, India.
What did it mean back then?
Usually cosmic or religious stuff.
Yeah.
It's a simple shape, easy to see in nature, Tree branches, stars, even tools like plows, and it resonated widely.
So a universal kind of symbol, but how does it become the symbol of Christianity? Especially given, well, crucifixion, not exactly a positive image initially.
Right, that's the fascinating part. Early on, especially during persecutions under emperors like Nero and through the 3rd century, being openly Christian was dangerous.
So flashing a cross around wasn't a good idea?
Probably not. It was the instrument of a brutal execution. So early Christians tended to use other symbols, more discreet ones.
Like the fish.
The fish, yeah, the ichthyes. Or the anchor. They also use monograms, like the crux ansata, which looks a bit like the Egyptian ankh, showing that blending of cultures.
Ah, interesting connection.
Yeah, or the iota chi, the first letters of Christ's name in Greek. Or the starogram, a tau and rho combined, symbolizing the crucifixion in a kind of shorthand.
A sort of secret code for believers.
Pretty much. It allowed them to identify each other without attracting unwanted attention for the Roman authorities.
Okay, so when does that change? When does the cross step into the spotlight?
The big turning point is Constantine, early 4th century.
His vision before the battle.
Exactly. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge, 312 AD. He reportedly sees the shining cross in the sky.
And adopts it as his standard.
Right. Suddenly, the cross is linked to victory, to divine protection, to imperial power. Then you have the Edict of Milan in 313.
Legalizing Christianity.
Yeah, opening the door for more public expressions of faith. And then, don't forget Constantine's mother, Helena.
Finding the true cross in Jerusalem.
Around 327 AD. That discovery, or the story of it, added huge weight to the cross's significance. And finally, the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 makes Christianity the official state religion.
Wow, so it goes from this symbol of shame and execution to, well, an emblem of the empire. That's some transformation.
It really is. And initially in that 4th century context, you see it mostly on imperial things, military standards, insignias. The symbolism is very much political, triumphal.
And what about early Christian art? Were they showing crucifixions then?
Not really, not explicitly. Early on, if they wanted to depict sacrifice or redemption, they'd often use Old Testament stories.
Like Abraham and Isaac.
Exactly, or Jonah and the whale. Stories that hinted at sacrifice and resurrection without showing the crucifixion directly.
To an indirect approach.
Right. But then around the middle of the 4th century, things start to shift. The cross itself begins showing up much more openly in art.
In mosaics, frescoes.
Mosaics, frescoes, sculptures, yeah. And its meaning is evolving. It's moving away from just being about punishment and becoming this symbol of victory over death, of redemption.
Okay, let's bring this back to Egypt. How did Christianity take root there, and how did that shape the art?
Egypt was really receptive to Christianity early on. Coptic tradition says the Apostle Mark brought the faith around 52 AD.
Do we have proof of that?
Well, direct proof is hard to come by, but given the close links trade, culture between Alexandria and Palestine then, it's definitely plausible.
Makes sense.
And we do have archaeological evidence of Christians in Egypt before Constantine. Things like wooden tablets from the mid-3rd century with Irene Peace written on them in Greek.
Ah, okay.
And the letter of St. Osiris from the late 3rd or early 4th century, which points to a Christian community in a more rural setting, not just the big cities.
So it was spreading, and Egypt itself was such a melting pot culturally.
Absolutely. That multicultural mix was crucial. It meant Coptic Christianity could absorb and reinterpret local Egyptian traditions and foreign influences.
You see that in the art.
Definitely. You see pharaonic motifs getting repurposed with Christian meanings. You see Hellenistic artistic techniques blended with a more uniquely Coptic style, often simpler, more symbolic.
It's like they were translating the faith into their own visual language.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And Christianity wasn't just in Alexandria. Monasticism played a huge role in spreading it.
Right. Figures like St. Anthony.
St. Anthony, St. Pachomius, starting in the 3rd century.
Yeah.
These monastic communities weren't just spiritual retreats. They became centers for developing distinct Christian art and architecture, too.
So where does the cross fit into Egyptian Christianity specifically? Was it used differently there?
What's really striking about Egypt is how early and how widely the cross seems to have been adopted. We find, frankly, more examples and more variety than in many other early Christian regions.
What kinds of crosses?
Early Coptic Christians used several main types. The Latin cross, the Greek cross, equal arms, the Crux Ansata, that ankh-like one we mentioned,
Right.
and the Templar or Pate cross, the one where the arms flare out at the ends.
Quite a range. Any specific early examples from Egypt?
Yeah, we find simple crosses and Christograms, those monogram symbols on things like ostraca, pottery shards used for writing,
Okay.
and papyri, even before the 4th century. And interestingly, not always in purely religious texts, suggests the symbol had some broader recognition.
So maybe not as taboo there even before Constantine.
It seems possible. We
Right.
also have a mural painting of a cross from a cemetery in Alexandria, dated to the 4th or 5th century. So the evidence suggests a degree of acceptance relatively early on in Egypt.
And then, as Christianity becomes more established, how does the cross feature in their churches?
It becomes central, both structurally and symbolically. You'd often find it prominently displayed in the apse, that semicircular space at the east end.
Above the altar.
Often, yes. Especially during periods like the Byzantine iconoclasm when figural images were controversial. The cross stood for the resurrected Christ, victory over death.
And structurally?
It was even worked into the architecture, into domes and vaults, symbolizing Christ's ascension, his rule over heaven. The 4 arms were often seen as reaching out to the 4 corners of the world, connecting heaven and earth.
So it's both a focus for worship and woven into the very fabric of the building.
Exactly. And in the monasteries, too, it was vital for personal devotion. Placed in niches, it became a focal point for monks' meditation and prayer.
Okay, we've traced the cross's journey. Now let's get back to our specific find, the Crux Gemmata. What exactly is it? What defines this type?
Right. So a Crux Gemmata is basically a jeweled cross. It became really characteristic of early Christian art and stayed popular right through the medieval period.
Jeweled meaning actual gemstones.
Typically, yes.
Yeah.
Usually set into the front face. But we also see the idea represented in other materials, mosaics, paintings, ivory carvings, stone reliefs.
And it wasn't just about looking fancy.
Oh no, far from it. The Crux Gemmata was loaded with theological and liturgical meaning. It's all about Christ's exaltation, his heavenly glory, his triumph.
Can you give us some famous examples so we can picture them?
Sure. There's the cross of Justin II from the 6th century. The crosses from the treasure of Guarazar in Spain, 7th to 8th century.
Okay.
The cross of Torre Jimeno, 7th century. And maybe more familiar later ones like the cross of Lothair or the Cross of the Angels, both 9th century.
So often made of precious metal, set with gems. What about those mosaic versions you mentioned?
Right, mosaics are key too. A stunning example is in Ravenna, Italy, the Basilica of Saint Apollinaire in Classe. The whole apse is dominated by this huge, jeweled cross mosaic from the 6th century.
What does that one signify?
Well, it definitely recalls the crucifixion,
Yeah.
but it also has this strong end times feel eschatological meaning. It points to the parousia, the second coming of Christ. It's about divine triumph, final redemption.
Powerful stuff.
Very. And you see other mosaic crosses from around the 5th and 6th centuries in places like Santa Prudencia, San Stefano Rotondo, and Santa Vitale in Ravenna as well.
So jeweled crosses are popping up in different forms across the Christian world. When do they first appear? What's the earliest evidence?
The first hints we get are around the late 4th century.
Ah, so after Constantine and the legalization of Christianity?
Exactly. The timing lines up with Christianity's expansion and its growing confidence and status. These early jeweled crosses really show that shift in perception, the cross moving from being primarily about death and torture to being an emblem of glory, resurrection, victory.
And how were they used in worship? Were they just decoration?
They were central. They were used in liturgical ceremonies, carried in processions as relics sometimes, but also served as major decorative focal points in churches.
Placed where?
Prominent spots. On altars, in apses. Their placement was deliberate, meant to convey these powerful theological messages about the glorified Christ and the hope of salvation. That Ravenna mosaic is a perfect example of that triumphant vision.
It really sounds like Constantine's vision and his adoption of the cross standard was fundamental to this development.
Absolutely fundamental. That story of the Milvian bridge, the vision, the in hoc signo vinces, by this sign you will conquer.
Right.
It directly led to the creation of the labarum, that military standard, a large cross made of gold, adorned with gems. It explicitly linked the cross not just with faith, but with imperial victory, with power, with legitimacy.
So it's this fusion of religious and imperial symbolism.
Precisely. The Crux Gemmata embodies that fusion.
Okay, so these jeweled crosses become popular. Was there one specific famous cross that maybe everyone was copying, a prototype?
That's a good question and something scholars debate. It's hard to point to one single definitive model, but there are two main candidates often discussed.
Which are?
First, there might have been a famous jeweled cross set up in Jerusalem at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
Right, at the supposed site of the crucifixion.
Exactly. Some accounts suggested gem-adorned cross was erected there, maybe around 440 AD under Theodosius II. A commemorative cross like that could certainly have been influential.
Makes sense. And the second possibility?
The other contender is a cross erected in Constantinople by Emperor Theodosius I. Descriptions say it was gold and covered in gems.
So maybe both played a role?
It's very likely. Probably a combination of these high-profile, imperial, and commemorative crosses helped inspire the trend.
Do we have any really early artistic depictions of these kinds of ornamented crosses that still survive?
We do have a few significant ones. There's a fragment from the Lateran, number 106, dated to the Theodosian era, late 4th century, which shows a decorated cross.
Okay.
The sarcophagus of Probus, also a late 4th century, has a cross with slightly curved arm ends, hinting at that more elaborate style.
Ah, interesting detail.
And there's a 5th century ivory diptych from Milan that includes a jeweled cross. Some scholars interpret that as reflecting the new triumphant status of the official Christian cross.
Now, the gems and the gold themselves, obviously valuable, but what did they symbolize in this context?
Oh, much more than just wealth. The gold and gems were packed with meaning. They stood for Christian triumph, definitely, but also for Christ's divine nature, something incorruptible, eternal.
Victory over death.
Exactly. Victory over death, spiritual rebirth. The sheer brilliance, the light reflecting off them, was meant to evoke Christ's divinity. It captured that paradox, the cross, representing both earthly suffering and eternal glory, punishment, and salvation.
And you mentioned other decorative features sometimes, like the curved arm ends.
Yes, those slightly outward curving ends are quite common. They're sometimes interpreted as symbolizing openness to the divine or the reach of salvation. And you sometimes see pendilia, too.
What are those?
Little hanging ornaments, often dangling from the horizontal arms. Sometimes they were shaped like the Greek letters alpha and omega.
The beginning and the end. We'll come rough to those. And this idea of the Crux Gemmata also representing the tree of life.
Yes, that's a really rich layer of symbolism. It connects to very old, Near Eastern ideas about life, regeneration, resurrection.
How is that shown?
Sometimes you literally see crosses depicted with leaves sprouting from them, making that connection explicit. It reinforces the idea of life emerging from suffering, Christ's victory over death promising eternal life. There's a great mosaic in the Church of San Giovanni Laterano showing a cross essentially formed from a palm trunk, a powerful image of that tree of life concept.
Fascinating. Okay, let's dive back into the specifics of the cross found in Oxyrhynchus. What are its physical details, size, materials?
Right, this specific cross, it measures 51.3 centimeters high and 40.4 centimeters wide.
Okay, so a decent size.
Yeah, and if you factor in the floral decoration around it, estimating based on symmetry where the top part is missing, the whole thing might have been about 64 centimeters high and maybe 58 centimeters wide.
And how was it made? Painted?
It was painted using tempera on a fine plaster base. That's a pretty typical technique for early Christian and medieval wall paintings. It gives it a kind of sober elegance.
What about the design, the type of cross, the decorations?
It's what we'd call a Roman open-ended cross, a common early form. The ends of the arms have these pearl-like adornments, which adds a touch of luxury.
And the color.
The main color is this orange-yellow, almost certainly meant to imitate gold.
Right, bringing in that symbolism of divinity, royalty we talked about.
Exactly. And then there are the gemstones. We can see where 14 main ones were. 5 were red, maybe representing jasper, garnet, possibly ruby, though that was rarer. 9 were blue, likely imitating lapis lazuli.
Are they all still there?
No, 1 red and 1 blue are missing now. And besides the main ones, there are smaller dots, smaller adornments. 6 at each arm end, 11 around the very center gem, 2 between the bigger gems on the arms.
What were those smaller ones meant to be?
Some of the white ones might well be imitating pearls. Pearls carry their own symbolism, purity, divinity.
And the floral patterns, they look quite prominent in the images.
They really are. You have 8 green branches. They look like palm fronds emerging from the corners near the center. They sort of surround and frame the cross.
Palms. So, victory, eternal life.
Precisely. Palms are rich symbols. Eternal life, resurrection, victory, triumph, even martyrdom. Seeing them sprout around the cross powerfully reinforces that tree of life idea we discussed. Life and renewal springing from the instrument of death.
Okay, and what about the alpha and omega? Where do they fit in?
They're located right at the base, sort of nestled within those floral branches.
The first and last letters of the Greek alphabet.
Right, representing the beginning and the end, invoking that passage from Revelation, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. It underlines Christ's eternal nature, his divine power.
And how are they depicted? Are they styled in a particular way?
They are, and it's interesting. The alpha is a capital letter, and it has this specific flourish at the top, sometimes called a pico or natto bridge, like a little decorative roof tile. And its foot, the base, is quite robust and decorated calzado.
Okay, and the omega?
The omega is different. It's simpler, looks more like a lowercase omega, and it's a closed elliptical shape.
So a noticeable difference in style between the 2 letters.
Yes, and apparently this specific pairing, the more elaborate capital alpha and the simpler lowercase omega, is something seen in other Christian art from Oxyrhynchus as well.
Right.
Seems to be a local stylistic convention.
So when you put it all together, the imitation gold, the gems, the palms, the alpha and omega, it's a really dense symbol.
Absolutely. Every element contributes. It speaks volumes about early Christianity in Egypt. Christ's sacrifice, yes, but overwhelmingly about resurrection, triumph over death, the promise of eternal life, divine glory. The richness itself is part of the message.
And the colors, too, they all carry meaning. You mentioned goldy yellow for divinity.
Right. And blue typically stands for purity. The heavens, maybe the Virgin Mary, eternity. Red connects to Christ's blood, his passion, martyrdom, but also royalty and divine love.
Green for the palms.
Green for hope, growth, resurrection, eternal life, the natural world renewed. And white, if those are meant to be pearls, signifies purity, innocence, faith, light overcoming darkness, holiness.
It's like a visual code, every detail carefully chosen. Now, you mentioned using some special imaging techniques for this analysis.
Yes, we use something called decorrelation stretch. It's a digital image processing technique run using ImageJ software in this case.
What does it do?
Essentially, it enhances the color information in an image. It makes subtle differences in hue and saturation much more visible than they would be normally.
Why is that useful here?
It's incredibly helpful for seeing faded pigments, understanding the original layers of paint, identifying materials really crucial for conservation work, but also just for detailed analysis. It's used in archaeology, art conservation, even geography and biology.
So it lets you see details you might otherwise miss. How did it help with this cross?
It gave us a much clearer view of the subtle color variations, the textures in the paint, tiny details that weren't obvious in standard photos. It helped confirm the pigment choices and understand the condition better.
And then you mentioned vectorization.
Right. After enhancing the image with decorrelation stretch, we vectorized it. That means converting the pixel-based image into one made of lines and shapes defined mathematically.
Why do that?
It allows for really precise analysis and manipulation of the different parts of the image, the outlines, the color areas, without losing detail or getting pixelated when you zoom in. It's much easier to measure things accurately and document the features. And the enhanced color info from the first step made this vectorization much more accurate.
So these digital tools are really changing how we study artifacts like this.
Definitely. They allow for a level of detailed, non-invasive analysis that just wasn't possible before. It's vital for preserving and understanding cultural heritage.
Now, thinking about this Oxyrhynchus cross, are there other similar examples of these glorified, triumphant crosses, cruces, gemmata found elsewhere in Egypt? Does it fit into a broader pattern?
Oh yes, absolutely. That's not an isolated find. We see similar things, especially in monastic contexts.
Like where?
Kelia, for example, out in the western desert. Excavations there uncovered monk cells and chapels with really richly decorated crosses.
Jeweled ones.
Yes, depictions of jeweled crosses, sometimes shown with garlands, incense burners, found in places like Combe 306, and other spots in Kelia, Combe 1920, Combe 45, Combe 219, Combe 90, also had ornamented crosses.
So it seems to have been a significant motif in these monastic settings.
It does. And look at the White Monastery in Sohag. Its funerary chapel has paintings of 3 jeweled crosses. And interestingly, they're surrounded by animals.
What kind of animals?
Lambs, deer, gazelles, peacocks. All animals that carried positive symbolism in early Christianity, often linked to salvation, paradise, rebirth.
Okay, so connecting the triumphant cross with symbols of salvation.
Exactly. And the nearby Red Monastery in Sohag also has crosses on its east wall that look like Crux Gemmata. The one might have fewer large gems, again likely representing Christ's triumph over death.
And the floral decorations on the Oxyrhynchus cross those palms, do they show up elsewhere too?
Yes, definitely. Back at Kelia, you see floral elements not just decorating crosses, but sometimes seeming to form part of the cross itself.
Similar symbolism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Garlands, palms, flowers, they all speak to that life-giving power of Christ. Victory over death, resurrection, regeneration. It's a consistent theme.
Okay, let's circle back to the alpha and omega on the Oxyrhynchus cross. You mentioned their placement. What's the deeper meaning of putting them there with the cross?
Well, technically, their position is sometimes classified as separated from the main cross structure, but that's a term borrowed from later Romanesque art, so maybe not a perfect fit.
Right.
But formally, you have that contrast, the elaborate capital alpha, the simpler lowercase omega. Theologically, though, their presence is huge. As scholars like Debias point out, together they signify the entirety of existence, the eternal nature, the divine essence of God, and specifically of Christ.
The beginning and the end.
Exactly, straight from Revelation. It powerfully reinforces Christ's divinity and his role as the sort and destiny of all creation. Early church figures like Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria wrote about this, sometimes linking the letters to the passage from earthly life to eternal life.
So a very profound statement. How common was this alpha and omega symbol in the early church overall?
It became quite popular, especially in the West. You see it a lot in Roman and Gallic art. It was used in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, too, maybe just a bit less frequently.
And in Egypt, in the Coptic Church.
It seems to have been particularly significant in Coptic Christianity. There, Alpha and Omega strongly symbolized eternal life, God's timelessness, Christ's resurrection, and the promise of the afterlife for believers. It really resonated.
Was it common to see them paired with crosses or other Christian symbols in Egypt?
Extremely common, yes. You find Alpha and Omega linked with Latin crosses, with crispons, those Syro symbols with stargrams, even with the Crux and Sada. They pop up everywhere.
Can you give us some examples of where they've been found in Egypt?
Sure. There's a cornice molding from Wadi Sarga in the British Museum. It has an ankh-like cross, a Crux ansata, holding a Greek cross. It contains Alpha and Omega.
Wow, layers of symbolism there.
Right. Another British Museum piece from Marmot has them with a Christogram and cruces ansate. They appear inside wreaths sometimes, in the center of a chi rho on another BM piece.
Textiles, paintings.
Yep. A textile from Akhmim in the Cairo Coptic Museum shows a figure holding a crown with Alpha and Omega. Wall paintings in Oxyrhynchus itself, in funerary contexts, show crosses with Alpha and Omega documented by Sabias Pascual and earlier by Breccia.
It sounds like they were almost ubiquitous.
They show up on wooden lintels from places like Ballot, numerous funerary stelae in Cairo and London, even on silver book covers, and on another textile showing a crux ansata with Alpha and Omega tucked under its arms. It really underscores how important this symbol pairing was in Egyptian Christianity.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize all of this. What's the big picture significance of finding this particular Crux Gemmata in Oxyrhynchus?
Well, fundamentally, the Crux Gemmata form itself is this incredibly potent symbol. It merges Christ's suffering, the passion, with ideas of kingship, divine victory, resurrection.
It's the glorified Christ.
Exactly. The gems, the gold, real or imitated, they tap into imperial imagery but translate it to signify Christ's divine, incorruptible nature. And that tree of life connection brings in themes of renewal, eternal life.
Emerging likely in the late 4th century.
Right, probably spurred by Constantine's influence and maybe those famous crosses in Jerusalem or Constantinople, even if we can't point to one single prototype.
And these jeweled crosses become a feature of Christian art, often in prominent church locations like the apse.
Yes, often defining the sacred space, symbolizing ascension. But the Oxyrhynchus one being found in a crypt chamber. That perhaps gives it a stronger connection to commemoration, to the hope of resurrection for those buried nearby.
And the Alpha and Omega reinforce that.
Absolutely. They hammer home the themes of eternity, divinity, the beginning and the end, especially in Egypt, where they carried such strong connotations of eternal life, salvation, rebirth within Coptic tradition.
So what makes this specific discovery so important?
It's the first actual Crux Gemmata painting documented from Oxyrhynchus itself. That's significant. Yeah. It tells us about the specific religious life and artistic practices in this major center during that period.
Evidence of Christianity consolidating its presence.
Yes, and potentially pointing to specialized artists working there. Finding it within the Basilica of Saint Philoxenus underlines the importance of that site.
And the parallels elsewhere in Egypt show it wasn't unique, but part of a wider trend.
Exactly. It reinforces how important these symbols of triumph and glory were across Egypt, representing Christ's victory over death. They served devotional purposes, ornamented sacred spaces, maybe were even linked to specific liturgies or consecration rites.
So ultimately, what does this find add to our knowledge?
It really expands our picture of Christian iconography in this crucial region. It gives us new insights into how artistic styles and religious ideas moved and were adapted in late antique Egypt. It's another piece in a very rich puzzle.
It really is remarkable how much meaning is packed into this single painted cross. It offers this unique window, doesn't it, into early Christian beliefs, art, and life in Oxyrhynchus. It weaves together imperial power, deep theology.
And discovering it really adds another dimension to our understanding of the Basilica of Saint Philoxenus and its place in that vibrant Christian community.
It makes you think, doesn't it? How did using these symbols of power, these precious materials, help early Christians express their faith in that complex cultural landscape?
And what other meanings might still be waiting to be uncovered in finds like this? It definitely sparks the imagination about what else might be hidden beneath the sands.
Absolutely. Well, if this has sparked your interest, we definitely encourage you to dig deeper. Look into the history of Oxyrhynchus, explore Coptic art, the symbolism of the early cross.
Yeah, check out the bibliography in the show notes for some starting points. There's a lot more to explore.
Indeed. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today.